Before we start, just want to give special thanks to Audio46 for providing me with this review unit of the Sony MDR-MV1. If you want to purchase the MDR-MV1, you can click the links down below, and if you do that, you will help support the channel, and I would be eternally grateful. Sony's MDR headphones are a classic series, with perhaps the most famous model in the series being the MDR-7506, which offers a clean, neutral sound at a very affordable price point. The unit we're going to be going over today is the newest addition to the MDR series, the Mv1, which comes in at $400 and is actually the first open-back headphone in the series. Sony actually doesn't have a lot in the way of open-back releases in general, and more interesting still, they designed the MDR-MV1 specifically for use in mixing and mastering spatial audio. For the purposes of this review, I'll be judging them with a reference use case in mind. I'll be going over the Mv1's fit and technical design and what it sounds like. But first, let's see what comes in the box. You get your MDR-MV1 open-back headphones, a 2.5 meter cable with a 6.35 millimeter unbalanced jack, a 6.35 to 3.5 millimeter adapter, a 1-year warranty, and a product guide. So the Mv1 doesn't come with much and is kind of unceremoniously packaged for a $400 headphone. I wish there was an additional shorter cable included with it, or better yet, a carrying case, or at least a carrying pouch. I mean, I don't know, just give people a little something more. I'm not particularly irked by it, considering headphones like this aren't intended to wander too far from the house or the studio, but it's worth noting for those who care about these details a little more than I do. Now, I promise we're about to get on to a ton of redeeming qualities, but I do have just one more criticism in this department. I'm feeling a little suspect about the build quality that we see with the MDR-MV1. Most of the housing and structural components are made from a seemingly thin sort of plastic. The headband, while lightly but sufficiently padded with memory foam, is encased in a kind of cheap synthetic leather. I think this look and build betrays the actual plethora of positive qualities that the MDR-MV1 has going for it from here on out. For example, when it comes to fit, the Mv1 is phenomenal. The included ear pads are made from a breathable suede and find a perfect density that squished comfortably against my head. Clamp pressure is fine-tuned and keeps the headphones securely on my head without the skull-crushing tension commonly found in the headbands of reference cans. While on one level I'm not such a fan about the amount of plastic we're seeing in this design, it's almost certainly responsible for how awesomely lightweight the Mv1 is at 223 grams. It's genuinely one of the most comfortable headphones I've ever had on my head, and I was able to wear it for hours on end without a trace of fatigue on my temples or around my ears. One pertinent observation worth mentioning is that the cans and pads don't leave a ton of room for listeners' ears. I didn't have issues with this as my ears err on the smaller side of things, but for those with larger ears, you might run into some issues here. Lastly, the cable. Pretty average build quality, not flimsy, not super sturdy, and it screws securely in place when connecting to the MDR-MV1. Good enough for me. Now, for technical design, I usually like to give you as much as I reasonably can, but after reading Sony literature on the MDR-MV1, I'm left with the impression that technical design is fairly straightforward. It's an open-back headphone with a low distortion, corrugated, high uniformity 40mm dynamic driver. Sometimes that's really all you need for a winning formula. I guess one note that I can make here is that the Mv1 has a 24 ohm impedance, which is surprisingly low considering its professional use case. Not really a complaint though. In fact, I kind of like seeing this as it makes the Mv1 an appealing headphone for non-professional use as well. Now, let's talk about what the Mv1 sounds like, starting with soundstage. So, the Mv1 is less concerned with producing a vast and dramatic stage than it is with performing fast, accurate, and fluid imaging. This strikes me as pretty appropriate for a headphone meant for professional and studio use, as I would use a similar description for other studio classics like the Beyerdynamic DT1990. Depth is presented in a strictly forward-facing fashion, and modestly extends a holographic stereo image just beyond my face. A little more spatial character is present in the Mv1's width, with hard pans producing a more convincing sense of distance than what I experienced in the depth. There's not much grandeur to be found here, but that's not really the point. Rather, this small stage couples with the MV1's precise imaging to produce a sensation of being able to reach out and grab an individual part of a mix. It's pretty sensitive in this sense, picking up on the most subtle panned position of a part and executing it flawlessly. It's on its smaller stage that a guitarist, bassist, vocalist, who or whatever it is, find distinct and pinpointed placements that stand firmly separated from one another. Dynamic pans that quickly move left to right occur with a speedy fluidity that's somewhat felt on the face, yet manages to avoid digressing to a two-dimensional linear character. Songs that feature dry instrument channels panned opposite from their wet reverb channels produce a stark binaural satisfaction. Basically, like any reference headphone worth its salt, the MV1 uses its stage as a tool to hone in on parts and plot precise locations and produce its spatial separation. But now, getting into its balance, starting with low end. There seems to be a recent trend of reference headphones throwing reasonable bass responses into their tunings, and as someone who makes and mixes music and relies on reference headphones, I'm 100% for this. In this sense, the MV1 doesn't disappoint, as it provides thick and natural mid-bass with a modest but not overdone sub-bass roll-off. Though I can't say I could get a proper bass slam from the headphone, I could get something pretty close to it without having to turn up the volume to very loud levels. Let's call it a punch. High bass is kept pretty firmly in check and keeps the low end cleanly separated from the mid-range while retaining accurate timbre details as well as impact. Now for mid-range. While I'm usually ready to call a reference headphone's mid-balance flat and call it a day, I can't say that that's what my experience with the MV1 was. Rather, it's here that the more treble-forward nature of the headphone starts to expose itself. Low mids are kept relatively flat and even with the quieter high bass, while high and even center mids start ramping early into the MV1's higher frequencies. This gives a somewhat intense and driving character to the overall sound signature. Rather than finding its reference character and being truly neutral, it finds it in being, excuse the taboo descriptors here, crisp or clear. But let me be specific with what I mean by this. High bass and low mids occupy a frequency range that, when over-amplified, produces a muddy signature that lacks good separation. The MV1's noticeable caution in this area in favor of the immediately preceding mid-range frequencies makes it a highly intelligible and articulate signature, even if it's not properly neutral. Guitars and vocals come through with a distinct emphasis in their overtones, aggressively avoiding the risk of congesting their lower fundamentals in the low mids, or high bass for that matter. And now, finally, high end. Like plenty of headphones made for mixing and mastering, the MV1 has some pretty intense moments in its treble. Actually, I take that back. More than moments, the treble response is through and through pretty heavily amplified, picking up where the high mids leave off. Side note here, I can safely advise the treble sensitive listeners who prefer dark signatures to avoid picking up the MV1. However, I have a penchant for brighter signatures and was pretty happy and excited by the exposing lift it offered in the balance. Upper harmonics were brought into sharp focus, as were reverb decays and cymbal transients. So while the MV1 doesn't find warmth in its, more backseat high bass and low mids, it finds a pretty high heat in its treble. But now, as much as I enjoyed the low and mid-treble amplitudes, I have just a small point of criticism for its upper treble. Saxophones and sawtooth synths, which share a common enough timbre quality, had a little too much buzz. When I dragged some tracks into a DAW to toy with a dynamic EQ and figure out just where this buzzy quality was coming from, I narrowed it down to somewhere between 12 to 14 kilohertz. Not to offend the religious anti-EQ crowd, I found creating a very light but sharp dip in this particular frequency range did a surprisingly effective job in negating the buzzy issue that I was having with the MV1's upper treble. So, an overall summary and evaluation of the MV1. While I don't think it's a truly neutral headphone, I nonetheless find it to be an excellent choice for those in the market for a somewhat affordable mixing headphone. It offers an articulate balance with solid and mostly realistic detail retrieval, accurate imaging, and an adequately fast performance. Even beyond their professional use case, their exceptional comfort and energetic balance has a lot to offer casual listeners as well as bedroom producers. Overall, I'm pretty impressed with what I heard with the MV1. If you're thinking about getting the DT 1990 or classics like it, you might want to check out the MV1 right along with it. I don't think it's any better or worse, but it's a different flavor of reference, and I think it's worth checking out. If you're thinking about getting the Sony MDR-MV1, you can help support the channel by clicking the links down below to purchase it from Audio 46, and I would be very, very grateful for that. Anyway, this is Chris with Major Hi-Fi, and I'll see you next time. Moondrop Blessing 3 video coming soon.